housing, base, housing, contractors,
housing, contractors, housing, contractors, housing, contractors, 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 housing.
Think base housing, contractors, base
housing.
Think base housing, base housing, contractors, base housing, think base think housing, contractors, base
contractors, think base contractors, base
housing,
think housing, base housing, think base,
Think contractors, housing, base housing, base
housing,
think contractors, housing,
base housing, contractors, housing, base
think contractors, think housing, base
Thank base.
contractors, base
Thank the house here.
housing,
Thank housing, contractors, housing
efficient in their environment squad.
Thank housing,
think housing, think housing,
thank housing, base housing, thank housing, base
Housing,
base,
thank housing,
contractors,
thank
housing, contractors, base, housing, think